In this video, I'll be upgrading a 2003 Ford Ranger with a 3-liter engine to a 150 amp alternator. I had upgraded this truck to an electric fan, and I also use a lot of accessory power on this truck, and 130 amp was not doing it. So, especially with the stock wiring, so I had decided to upgrade to 150 amp and to redo all the wiring to make sure I was getting ample charging amps. I removed the cold air intake on the truck to make it easier access. I also removed the battery. I disconnected the alternator and both battery terminals. I also removed the actual terminator or the actual terminal itself because I'm going to go to a splice base unit because the cables were too tight and I didn't like the strain that was on the cables as it was. Or wires, I mean to say, instead of cables. I disconnected the 3G alternator plugs or connectors and the stator connector. I decided I was going to wire new ones in because the factory ones are pretty thin and look pretty worn. I removed the charge wire. And one thing to keep in mind, I don't change the alternator in this video. I'd already done it. But there's only 3 bolts actually holding the alternator on. At this point, it would take less than 5 minutes just to remove the 3 bolts and pull the alternator out after doing this. As you can see, I removed the battery. I also removed the starter solenoid harness. The starter solenoid harness has 2 wires. One wire goes directly from the alternator to the starter solenoid, and the wire then goes back to the battery. I simply cut this wire to only be 1 wire that goes straight to the battery terminal. This wire is not thick enough to use, as you need a 4-gauge wire to charge the battery for the alternator. So the reason I cut and go to 1 wire and don't leave the wire in the harness just unconnected is that's a lot of power just sitting in the harness, and I didn't want that. And it's 10 millimeter socket to remove these nuts from the starter solenoid. I cut into the harness and cut out the original charge wire. I did leave the original charge wire in the harness, but it wasn't connected to power. The reason I had to leave it is it goes through several different harnesses before it ends up at the battery. So that's why I did that. The only wire I was using for the original harness was the green wire, and this is the wire that goes and tells your cluster if your alternator or your battery is low on power. But the rest of them I just taped up and didn't use. I ran a whole new wire harness for the yellow wire and the actual charge wire. I use quick connects. That way if I had any problems or needed to change anything, I could quickly do so. And here I am taping up the original harness and only using the green wire. I made a new wire harness with a 4-gauge power cable. Usually these alternator cables are red and not black. I had purchased this online through a vendor, and honestly I would not purchase this kit again. I would recommend buying one from Summit. Not that it was a problematic kit, it just was weird that it was a black cable and not a a red wire like you're used to seeing. I ran a secondary wire that was a 10 gauge, and this is going to be connected to the yellow wire and go to the starter solenoid. What this yellow wire does is return power back to the alternator so it charges. The point of this wire is if the fuse or the integrated fuses that are on the original wire that I was no longer using blow, it would no longer send a signal back to the alternator, it wouldn't charge. I always run the yellow wire back to the starter solenoid. And the wires go underneath the lowest hose, which is kind of a pain as you can see as I'm wiring this up. I went ahead and wired in the charge wire and reconnected the 3G connectors after installing the new ones. And the nut that it came with was a 10 millimeter. I simply installed the protection boot back onto the charge wire here. Again, I'm reconnecting the 3G wire. The green goes to the cluster, the yellow goes to the starter solenoid, and the white one is just the stator which loops back to the alternator. And I did install a new stator plug while I was at it. I went ahead and taped it up to make sure nothing was exposed. I wanted to make sure the new wire harness I made followed the pattern of the old wire harness. So what I did is I zip tied it to the existing harness. And this was a little bit of a pain, but if you do it right, you shouldn't have to mess with it again. The harness I made was 4 feet long. It was a little too long. I had to cut some length off, but 4 feet is a good, estimate when creating the harness. Here I installed a fuse block, and this fuse block uses mini fuses. And I installed a 170 amp fuse. That's what's recommended if you have a 150 amp alternator. I went back and zip tied the harness to the existing one just to make sure it looked clean. Because I had a splice to cut the original charge wire and pull out the starter harness, starter solenoid harness that is, I went back and taped it back up when I was done. Now you can see the new starter harness here only has one wire. I cut one of them off. I retaped it and put it back into shielding. So this is the splice that I used. So the new charge cable is going to go directly to the battery terminal. This splice is only connecting the main power harness and the starter solenoid wire. This was used again because the wires had become short. They had been cut over the years. So I wanted something that wasn't putting too much stress on the cables, or wires that is. Now I wired the connection for the yellow wire to the starter solenoid. Reinstalled the nuts holding down the starter solenoid harness. And then I installed the terminal to fuse block wire. And as you can see here, it's completed. The charge wire goes directly to the terminal. The other wires you're seeing there are for the electric fan that's in the car. And I went ahead and reinstalled the covers. And the project was completed, and it resolved my low amperage problems I was having. Before, the gauge would be all the way down by the L. It was producing that low of power. And you can see once I installed, I was running 14.1 at idle.
So if you like this video, go ahead and smash the like button below. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell if you want some notifications. See you next time on Chasing Mustangs.
Thanks.
All right.
Great job.
Yeah, I see it like literally every day.